joining us this late hour. But firstly, our thanks go to Simeon, who kindly agreed, despite his very tight schedule and short stay in Tbilisi, to visit yet another time our campus and our university and give us a very interesting overview and presentation of his very recent book, which I'm very proud to receive with the author's signature, so I'm really honored by that. And plus, this has visited, to our campus and to the country has nicely coincided with the announcement of the Doing Business 2015 result. I think this audience knows well that Simeon is one of the architects of this rating, the ideology and the methodology and so bolts and nuts of it. And I think his views on the results, recent changes and so on would be of interest for you. Okay, Simeon, thank you very much. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I'm visiting for the day, and then I thought I would like to see the university and how it's developing, and maybe have a short talk. So I wouldn't call it a lecture. I would just say a few things. And while indeed the main point was about my book Inside the Euro Crisis, which came out about 2 or 3 months ago, we have actually another book which is probably coming literally at the end of this week, which is dedicated to 25 years of transition in the whole region, where I'm one of the 2 co-editors. I was hoping that I would be presenting that tonight, but I'll come separately for that book. That book is interesting because in it there is a chapter on Georgia written by Kaha Bendukidze and President Saakashvili, but a lot of the people of their team, I'm sure, have contributed quite a bit in that chapter. So next time, which may be very soon, I promise to present not just the Georgia part, which you know well, but also what happened in a number of other countries, including in my own country, in some of the leading reformers like the Czech Republic and Poland, and a good summary of 25 years of transition where we are now. Instead, since this is not quite ready, what I'll talk today is combine some of these topics and talk a bit about Georgia and Europe, roughly speaking. You've recently signed an association agreement with the European Union. This is very exciting. It was very exciting when Bulgaria signed such an agreement 10 years or so ago, but with that come lots of expectations, some of which have been met and many of which have not been actually met, at least in the case of Bulgaria, and I would argue a number of other countries. So maybe this is where I thought we would go tonight. But before I get to Georgia and Europe, as some of you who we've worked in the government and so on, think of the association agreement recently signed. It is the fruit of a very long process, of which not this government, but the previous governments have all worked to get to that point. And in some small ways, I've also been involved in that, not the agreement itself, but some of the efforts of previous governments to get to the point of having such an agreement. So I'll start with that a few words. I actually first came as part of the World Bank to Tbilisi in the winter of 1997, so a long time ago. In fact, it was one of my first assignments for the World Bank. And my task at the time was to try to convince the then government, Shevardnadze's government, to do microeconomic reforms. I personally quickly found out that no reforms are going to happen here, so there is no much point to spend significant time on that. and asked to be reassigned to another country. Then my director at the time said, well, we have another project in Georgia. Would you like to shift to it? And I said, well, what is the project? And they said, advising on privatizing and modernizing the wine industry. And so, okay, I don't know anything about wine, but, let's try. So actually, maybe even the people that I've worked for a long time here don't know, but my first real project in Georgia was trying to advise the then state-owned wineries and cognac makers how to make and market wine and so on. I don't think it was a very successful project since I didn't know much about it, but I got to spend a lot of time in Georgia, and when the Rose Revolution came, I was one of the few people at the World Bank who actually consistently over a period of 6-7 years had visited Georgia and knew something about its economy, regulation, and so on. And from 2004 to about 2008 maybe, I was coming quite often and working with the governments then on improving the business environment. This is when this idea of doing business in Georgia and let's improve not just on this ranking, but on all the other rankings that exist came about, and we worked, especially the government worked very hard to get from, I forget what was 150th or 104th, 112. I think at some point it was even worse than that, but there are fewer countries then, so maybe it sounds like it was to, I think, number 8 was 2000 and was the best ranking, which Georgia has lost this year, but this is a different story. So a very, very big success over really a period of time, and a big success not just for this region, but anywhere actually in the world. We haven't seen at the World Bank such a rapid improvement over such a period of time. There were reforms in many other areas. I remember, for example, the early period 97-8 when we were constantly being stopped by the police driving around Tbilisi, so you basically had to hire somebody who is police so that the police doesn't stop you when you drive, and this type of things that hopefully are forgotten by now by most. And here we are sort of 10 years after the reforms started, 2004, with an association agreement and looking towards sometime in the hopefully not so distant future to join the European Union. Joining the European Union is very exciting. I remember in Bulgaria when we managed to get the invitation about a decade ago, what excitement it was. But it also raised the expectations of the Bulgarian society greatly. Basically, the thinking was that now, once we are truly in Europe, they're going to give us lots of investment. They're going to basically help us to run our country better. They're going to invest in infrastructure. It's going to be great. And for some countries of Central and Eastern Europe, you can say that that sort of happened. The further north you are, the more you can say that. But for other countries like Bulgaria, like Romania, like Hungary, like Slovakia to some extent, actually didn't quite happen. So the countries entered the European Union with very high expectations, and for a couple of years it seemed like things are going to be significantly better. And then for various domestic political reasons or issues of corruption, quickly money from the European Union were cut for substantial periods of time. And if you look back in some of the Central European countries, this year it's 10 years since entry into the EU. In Bulgaria and Romania it's 7 years. There are some improvements, certainly, so societies have changed tremendously, but there are also many areas where there is more skepticism and more negative views on the entry into the European Union than certainly were at the beginning. Why am I saying that? I'm saying that to make the point that it's good to enter the European market, both politically and economically. It can bring a lot of benefits. But basically, whatever your government does, whatever Georgia does for itself is the most important. Nobody else is going to do much for you. My book, incidentally, that was shown today is sort of on the same topic. I became finance minister in Bulgaria in July of 2009, just as the financial crisis was starting to develop. And for the next about 4 years, I spent almost as much time in Brussels as I spent in Bulgaria dealing with the Eurozone crisis and Greece and Spain and Ireland and Portugal and so on, collapsing one after another. And there was a lot of discussion in the country of ways the EU to help us with infrastructure, ways the EU to help us with social funds. They were helping a lot, but it was perceived that it should be more. And the answer was, well, the EU is very busy fighting its own crisis, the Eurozone crisis, and that's the main issue that for the last 4 or 5 years has been on the EU agenda. And again, basically, unless you do such reforms or such changes that your country, what depends on you, is done, entry into the European Union in itself is not going to help you that much. The early government, certainly in Bulgaria, didn't understand that. So they truly thought that once you're part of the European Union, many of your issues are resolved. And it did not turned out to be the case. And it didn't turn out to be the case in a number of other countries, which is why that after the financial crisis now, the Eurozone crisis has been going on for 5, in some cases 6 years. When you look at the political landscape in Europe, you see a lot of nationalist parties, not just in the poorer countries, but actually also in some rich countries, the ones saying, well, the EU is not helping us enough, roughly speaking, so why should we be so focused on Europe? And nationalist parties in the north saying, well, why should we be helping these guys at all? They're not really grateful for what we are doing for them. So if you've looked at the last 2 years, European Parliament elections, local elections, you would notice that in a number of countries, both in the north and the south, nationalist parties actually have picked up quite significantly. Again, because there were expectations on each side that the one would grow and develop as democracies very fast and very successfully, and would become like the other part of Europe. And it didn't quite happen for most countries. It didn't. And in the East, an understanding that there will be a lot more assistance, a lot more guidance, a lot more help, and that also didn't come. Through. So the point of this discussion so far: whatever you do, do it regardless of which bloc you're in. The bloc can only help you go further and expand your economic prospects, but it cannot do it for you. So given that, the other topic that we wanted a bit to discuss today is regulations, improvements in the economy, the certainty of doing business. As you may have seen today, or you'll see by tomorrow in the media, this is a year that the Doing Business Index that was started 12, 13 years ago happened to come out today, and the results for Georgia are, let's say, less positive than they have been in the last 3, 4, 5 years. So there has been a decline in the relative ranking of Georgia. Some of that is due to methodological changes. So there are some changes to the indicators that basically helped some countries, hurt some other countries. So on average, the methodology was neutral, but it dropped some countries, Georgia as well, by a couple of places. But if you look carefully at the results, what you also see is that for the same regulation, so regulation hasn't changed, the laws have not changed in in Georgia, at least on the indicators that are covered in doing business. But in a couple of places, one is paying taxes. The efficiency with which these laws and regulations are used, or at least the perception of this efficiency, has deteriorated. In other words, businesses now think that it takes longer time, and actually it's uncertain how long it takes to do the particular procedures, filing annual reports, doing tax reporting and so on, that it did in the past. So in other words, regulations stayed the same, but applying that regulation suddenly, or not suddenly, over the last year, started being a lot more uncertain, or you can say a lot more uneven. So sometimes you're happy, sometimes you're not happy. As a result, on average, you don't quite know what you do. And for investors, this is quite bad, because you want to have a lot of predictability, especially with regards to procedures like tax compliance, because if you don't have that predictability, it's also very hard for you to plan your business investments, to plan your next year's sales, and so on. So something is happening in the data. It's early to tell, for me at least, since I'm no longer part of the doing business team. I haven't had enough time to analyze what exactly is happening. But what seems to be happening is that at least a large section of businesses that are interviewed by the doing business team are less clear what the rules are. And since the rules haven't changed, at first this is a bit strange. It's normal, if a rule changes, for you at first not to know exactly what's happening. So some time is necessary to be clear on the application of the rule. But if the rules have not changed, they've stayed the same, and suddenly you have increased uncertainty on how they are applied, well, that means that whoever is applying it, the agency that is applying it, somehow is doing things that it shouldn't be doing, or at least is perceived to be doing things that it shouldn't be doing. From that perspective, it would be quite interesting to see what happens for the next year's doing business report, because more and more of the indicators in it, more and more of the rankings will have an increased component of this, if you like, certainty or uncertainty of applying the indicators. The perception on the side of business, given the same regulations, and that we know for investors is quite important. So going back then to Europe and maybe even the rest of the world. 10 years ago, Georgia basically was either not known to the rest of the world, or if it was known with the fact that, there was no electricity most of the time, that, the police was extremely corrupt, that you have to drive backwards on some streets because for some reason there were one-way streets where they shouldn't have been, and all these kind of things that sound good in dinner conversation, but you don't really want to be associated with them. So that's 10 years ago, not such a long time ago. And then in a period of several years, there was a tremendous progress, and an explanation of that progress for the rest of the world. So Georgia received and currently has an image internationally of a small country that managed to overcome the difficulties of the post-communist transition, the particular features of the local Georgian transition, to become a model transition economy. And this is why there has been so much interest both by financial institutions like the World Bank, my own old institution, and foreign investors. Now we're in a situation where, as I mentioned, on some aspects of the business environment, investors are not so sure actually whether this is the environment that they face or there's some other environment that doesn't look like the regulations suggested, but it may be in place. This is combined with the picture in the emerging markets overall, which is actually not very beneficial to any of the emerging markets, where some of the large emerging markets, Russia, the issues well, Brazil also on the other side, basically have no growth. and seem like they're not going to have growth for some time. The Indian economy, after a decade of high growth, basically has near collapsed. China is slowing down, and a few other. The government in Argentina is doing strange things. Venezuela, even more. So suddenly emerging markets, which for the last 12, 13 years have been the excitement for most investors, are no longer that exciting, or maybe they're too exciting, so investors don't really want to spend so much time into them. So if you look roughly for the last 2 years, started sometime in late summer of 2012, and especially last year was the case, there is actually a pullback from investment in emerging markets as a group, not specific emerging markets, but overall. Investment in emerging markets have actually both this year but also last year gone down significantly. Investors just don't have the appetite to go into these riskier markets. If on top of that you put the fact that here in Georgia there seems to be some recently created uncertainty about how rules are applied in certain areas, it makes it even more difficult to think how things can develop in the future in the same consistent way of having relatively high economic growth rate that Georgia has enjoyed for nearly a decade. But since I don't want to finish sounding very very negative, so what does this teach us? Well, as I mentioned, accession to the European Union is going to be a longer process than for most Central and East European economies, precisely because the EU has a lot of issues on its own to resolve. The European economy, most European economies have had significant issues internally, and looks like these issues will continue. So we cannot say that in 2 years, in 3 years, in 5 years, we can talk about Georgia in the European Union, but I'm sure that in a decade or so, Georgia will be part of the European Union. And in this process, as long as it's credible, there'll certainly be a pickup in interest on the side of investors just because of political uncertainty being diminished significantly once you enter the European Union. And of course, the ability to use EU funds more so than now. But as a very small country, smaller than the majority of countries in the European Union, any shift that happens either in regulations or laws or in the usage of these regulations and laws has a lot bigger effect than in a large country in terms of changing both investors' sentiment, but also the views for the rest of the world of what is happening in this economy and how likely it is that it is going to be a high growth economy. In that regard, indicators like doing business help. They don't give you the full picture, they're just one small part of the picture, but they say, well, here it seems like the improvement that have been achieved is sustained, and that's good. You should always try to do more, but at least it's sustained. In some indicators, it seems like that maintaining the achievements that have been done is no longer there, or is shaky. And it's very dangerous to go in this direction because it's very easy once you make a couple of wrong steps to continue down that path. There have been countries, and I will finish with this. In the book that I mentioned, the 25 years of transition, we started writing it as a very positive book. Look, these countries were all under communism 25 years ago, and now, with a few exceptions in Central Asia, they've converted to some forms of democracy, most of them full democracy, and basically have gone a long way towards free markets. But in particular countries, you have actually also seen what we call reform reversal. So a country starts developing well. One example is Hungary. The country starts as a big reformer, And Hungary did start as one of, if not the biggest reformer, certainly one of the two big reformers together with Poland, in 89, 1991 until about 95, 96. And since then, Hungary has done nothing. So if you compare GDP per capita 1996 in Hungary, and if you compare now, it's barely grown. The growth in, 18 years is about 20% or so. In that same period, countries like Poland, Estonia more than doubled, actually in the one case tripled, GDP per capita. So there are countries that start well and then get stuck. There are countries like Slovakia that start a bit, get stuck for a long time without reforms, and actually even a reversal of reforms, improve again, and then again start reversing. My own country has experienced this up and down, including most recently. And there are very few countries that have consistently, over the period of 20 some years, have followed a more or less consistent path to both political freedom as well as economic freedom. But if you look at the 25 countries in our about 30 countries actually in the Central and East European region, including the former Soviet Union, you can maybe count 3-4 countries, the Baltics mostly, maybe the Czech Republic, that have consistently gone towards freer markets and also more open political system. Everybody else, sometimes for a short time, sometimes for a long time, has had reversals, or at least delays or slowdowns. So I'll finish with this. I hope that Georgia doesn't have a reversal. I hope that it doesn't have a significant slowdown because it's quite costly. You compare with everybody else. You compare, as I mentioned, Hungary, how far ahead of everybody else it was in the mid-90s, 20 years ago. You compare Hungary now in terms of economic growth, and level of economic development, it has been surpassed by another 6 countries in the region. It was number 2 after Slovenia at the beginning of the process. Now it's number 8. And that's even at the top, not to mention some of the countries like Ukraine. I would not go into a discussion of Ukraine, where there were very big hopes, very big support from financial institutions, both private and public, and basically in 25 years, the GDP per capita today of Ukraine is 25% less than it was in 1989. So in 25 years, you've lost 25% of your GDP per capita. There are a couple of other countries, incidentally, like this, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, that are now poorer than they were 25 years ago. So transition has many dimensions, some quite successful, some not so successful, but generally going in the right direction. And some countries that started but never got anywhere. Georgia for 10 years has gone consistently and has been a star performer after late start. So the first 10 or so years of, 15 really years of transition were lost to Georgia. Then it had to catch up. Now it's slowing down again. There is no more convergence. Hopefully that changes, and next year we can meet before next year, but by next year we have some more positive forecast to go forward. So I'll finish here, not talk too much, and if you have some comments or questions, please.
Just recently there is a new idea spreading over European political arena. This is flexible fiscal policy. What do you think about this?
It's not really, it's basically populism, but you need to call it something positive, so you call it flexible fiscal policy, which basically says, which comes from mostly from Southern Europe. France, Italy are the main proponents, but it has a few other proponents on and off, that says, this is a period that's been hard consistently for Europe. Money is very cheap, so why don't we continue having high deficits. And European Union in this regard has difficulty addressing it. If it was a small economy and it said that, they would say, we'll penalize you so heavily that you immediately forget about flexible fiscal policy. But if it's Italy and France, okay, maybe this is a good idea, so let's discuss it. So I think it's first of all, it's a very double standard to have, depends on who it comes from. But there is this idea of flexible fiscal policy. Again, it's not really flexible, it basically just says that sometimes over even longer periods of time than we thought before, you can run large deficits. That idea, actually economic theory can tell you, in principle, it can work in emerging markets. So you can have an emerging market where the growth prospects are such in the future that if you think you can help it with bigger government investment, private as well, by the way, but government investment mostly in infrastructure, so that you help the private economy develop. Even basic economics tell you that over some period of time, you can run consistent budget deficits as long as they are invested in productive assets or productive infrastructure. And then the private sector grows fast as a result of that. In fact, several of the East Asian countries in the past have done that. If you look at Thailand or Malaysia in the 80s and early 90s, they did run large deficits for a while. Both of these countries and most other countries that did that, after that had very significant crises. So there is no way avoiding crisis if you're running flexible fiscal policies. Sooner or later, you are going to have a big crisis. And in the case of the East Asian countries, it came in the mid to late 1990s. But at least the theory of it is that if you have high growth prospects and you think that you're far from your production possibility frontier, then it may make sense. But if you're thinking of countries like Italy or France that are basically mature economies, or most of the European countries, it's a struggle to think where exactly is this gap in the production possibility frontier that they have to fill. In other words, is there some capacity that they're currently not utilizing and they will utilize if you do this investment? And the answer is no. So the economic theory tells you that what they call flexible fiscal policy is just governments unwilling to do the type of reforms that they need to do so that eventually they can return to some significant growth path. And the reason these countries, in addition to being mature economies, are unlikely later on to have a very significant pickup of growth is their demographic situation, which is different from the demographic situation here, which is different from the demographic situation in Asia, which is that their workforce is also shrinking over time. All of Europe, but in particular several of the countries in Europe, basically every year there are fewer and fewer workers. So not only it's hard to see where higher productivity is going to come from in the future, if you have more public investment, but it's also not clear who would be actually these extra workers so that extensively you can create more production. So on that, my view has always been you first need to stay roughly within the deficit close to zero or close to a target prescribed by Maastricht, maybe even less. When I was finance minister in Bulgaria, we passed a law to basically have the deficit below 2% every year. And the more you go beyond that, the more and more examples we have, certainly around Europe, that eventually you're going to have a major public finance crisis, and then you're really also going to have a collapse of the economy. I'll just finish with the topic that the US, because I know that the US also has discussed this topic and incidentally went away from it. So the budget deficit there has shrunk very significantly in the last 3-4 years. But they had this discussion. They had the discussion that unlike Europe, the population there is actually expanding, so there are more and more workers every year, so they can afford actually, in principle, to grow their labor force and then to pick up productivity there. But after the discussion there, they still thought, given that, it's unlikely to come up with a good scheme to invest public resources efficiently. So let's not do it. And the deficit, which about 4 years or 5 years ago was nearly 13%, is now about 2.6%, I think, for this year. Maybe there will be some breakthrough in economic thinking to tell us that that's not the case, but so far I think both theory and evidence suggest that on some things you shouldn't be very flexible. Other points? Yes, Veto?
So, what is your assessment of the currency peg which Bulgaria already exercises for 15 years, I guess? I may preempt your answer as a scholar, but all the criticisms to currency peg come from let's say, empiric, in brackets, evidence is managing the crisis. So you were in charge of, as a Minister of Finance, to manage the crisis in your country. So what is now your view on the currency peg?
So Bulgaria implemented the currency peg actually a bit more even than 15 years ago, so we have quite a lot of experience with it, and with the exception of Lithuania, we are now, I think, the only country in the EU that has had the currency peg for so long, but is not yet a member of the Eurozone, because Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia entered the Eurozone before us. So in some sense, the discussion in Bulgaria is bigger than most other countries, being, okay, you're on the peg for so long, but you're not on the euro, so some of the benefits of, in principle, the peg you're not earning. So why are you still on the peg? So when I was finance minister, I always defended the peg. So as an economist, I would have thought otherwise most of the time. But as finance minister, something that was already given was for a long time in Bulgaria. I didn't want to have any discussion of what's the alternative. But I can have such a discussion now. So on the positive side, the peg in Bulgaria was put not so much because of monetary policy, although that of course was the immediate concern after the banking crisis in 96-97, but because it was thought, I think very correctly, that institutions in Bulgaria are not mature enough, they're corrupt enough, so that if you leave such an important policy in the hands of Bulgaria, basically sooner or later it would be screwed up. Basically, Bulgarian politicians of different parties and over time. So I think the peg was very helpful in avoiding Bulgarian politicians dreaming up monetary policies. Not that a small country like Bulgaria can have an independent monetary policy really, but you always have crazy people in politics who somehow think that they'll do something new and innovative and different from everybody else. So I think I like the currency peg because it eliminated the need in parliament or by governments to discuss monetary policy and by the central bank to do anything. And there was a big discussion when I was finance minister that see countries with flexible exchange rates like Poland especially were doing significantly better during the financial crisis, which is true factually. But there are also some countries like Romania that were not doing better, so you can always point to examples. And the argument was, given what I've written in the book, how inefficient European institutions showed to be during this crisis, maybe the Bulgarian Central Bank is actually a better institution to run, a better version. You know, it's not the best, but maybe it beats the Europeans. And certainly for a period of time, it seemed like that was the case. But more recently, if you followed, I doubt that many people have followed Bulgarian news, but one of our largest banks is about, I think, to go into bankruptcy, and it seems the evidence suggests that the central bank has, over a long period of time, consistently mishandled its supervision. So in other words, that our central bank is not as good as we thought, maybe actually it's not good at all. So from that perspective, having the peg, just not having at all in the policy area discussion of monetary policy is actually a good thing. Against that, economists always say flexible exchange rate helps the economy. My view is that for small countries like Bulgaria, like Georgia, we are so small relative to the rest of the world that actually the flexible exchange rate doesn't help us that much, that we're just too small to matter. I would argue that even Poland is too small to matter, although they think otherwise, and they do think that the flexible exchange rate has helped them. But now Poland is entering a period of recession, so they managed to prolong the period of growth, but not escape it altogether. So for smaller countries, my view would still be better to pack to where you're entering. If you're entering the European Union like we were targeting then, better pack to the euro. It has some negatives, but the positives are bigger than the negatives, and we're anyhow too small to matter in the global monetary world. Any other?
So this question is regarding the doing business rating. So if I could put it in a nutshell, so when it was created, it was based on the ideology that the less regulations, the better. Of course, with some, I mean, how to say, exceptions, but it's a general doctrine. Now, as I see, the ideology is shifting towards the fewer, the better, but, and then it depends. Yeah. And then we have sometimes even in some cases already the indications that the more, the better. So for instance, I can recall new, how to say, standard for the getting permit topic. I don't know whether it entered this year or it's coming next year, that if the architects and engineers are licensed, then the country gets credit. Whatever, I mean, somehow, given some stamped papers, yeah, whatever you call it. So how would you comment on that?
At first, so doing business was created more than a dozen years ago. By now, even though it's a global index, it really was created under the logic of transition. So both myself and some of the people who worked with me, Professor Andrei Schleifer at Harvard was the other main person, were really scholars of transition at the time, and we basically noticed, and there was at the same time some evidence from Latin America. Hernando de Soto is famous for that, but there are a lot of other actually Latin American less known economists who basically are working in exactly the same direction. And actually transition, maybe not political transition so much, but economic transition in Central and Eastern Europe and Latin America is remarkably similar in the early to mid-90s, in sort of getting rid of socialist or communist central planning kind of features and going towards a free market. So that was the ideological basis for the Doing Business project, and it roughly said what you say, that the less government intervenes and tries to impose its view on how business activity should be done, the better. Not just for the, let's say, the conservative or liberal reasoning that less regulation is better. This is some part of it, but also the observation coming from institutional economics that even if governments in developing or emerging markets have the right thing, the right idea how to regulate, they're too corrupt basically or too inept. So they're not going to they're going to screw it up. and this is I've had again as finance minister, it's again in the book, I've had this discussion of the flat tax in Bulgaria. It curiously was implemented by a socialist government in Bulgaria just before us. The socialist government implemented it and immediately started asking to scrap it. So I had to fight the previous government's decision to scrap its own flat tax. And the discussion that I had in Bulgarian that really actually worked as an argument was not is this socially optimal tax or not, but the comment of, so you see our tax office in Bulgaria, do you think these guys are efficient and honest so that they are going to be able to implement progressive tax system or some other tax system? You know who they are, right? And there was this understanding that, yeah, these guys, even a flat tax is difficult for them to implement, so let's not impose something even more complicated. So I think that part is often forgotten in the discussion of regulation, but for me at least, it's actually the more important part. That even if a government in emerging markets has the right idea how to regulate, let's suppose, they're not going to be able to do it. Implementation is going to fail. And therefore, it's better to be simple at first. And once you're rich, then perhaps you can go to more complicated levels of regulation. So if you look at doing business, Luxembourg or Belgium, for example, are not doing very well in the ranking. Luxembourg is like number 60 or something like that. They can afford it, they can do complicated things. It's not good perhaps, but at least they would implement it somehow, but emerging markets cannot. So that's how we started. As most processes and most institutions, the World Bank is also a political institution, so there are also politicians on the board deciding in which directions it should go and its product would go. And every year the Doing Business team, when I was manager, but also after that, has had this pressure to not have this, if you like, institutional framework, but basically to go towards better regulation. Not towards less or simple, but towards better regulation. Better regulation to me as an economist is a nonsensical thing. I mean, better regulation is what I think is better regulation when I'm in the government, and the next government is going to think that other regulation is better regulation. So it's not well defined, which is why I don't like it. But politicians like it because they can interpret it however they like. And indeed, over the last 3-4 years, the Doing Business project has resisted, but not always successfully, this bend towards including some features of better regulation. It's unavoidable in the institutional, let's say, development of the product. I think over time there would be resistance to do too many changes, but we've seen this year that there are, I think, more than the necessary changes. But it's a process, and in this process, politics also plays a role. Anything else? We have just a few more minutes. Well?
You were saying about some chances to use a flexible fiscal policy. I'm back to my question, and it can be sometimes maybe successfully in some occasions, but in reality, of course, we would doubt that maybe this will push forward some kind of parasitizing ideas. But the other thing is that if you leave alone these wrong attitudes it can create, this is another thing, that there is a political circle there, and politicians, they need to win the elections again. So when they start such kind of policies, they want to stop maybe one moment, but then they have elections in future, then they cannot stop this immediately.
Yeah.
They need to postpone, and then they will continuously postponing, and I think that this is especially very bad for small countries like Georgia.
No, I agree. So I think that's why for small countries, that's bad for big countries as well. So this is what's happening in both France and Italy. France and Italy, different governments say that they are not populist, but actually they are populist. And the next government comes and says, we are not going to be populist, but actually they are populist as well. So it's contagious. I think it's a lot more contagious in small countries because very quickly it becomes obvious that flexible fiscal policies don't work. And there are many reasons why in a small country flexible fiscal policy doesn't work. The main reason is that you don't produce many of the things that you want to spend on. So that's why when we have a discussion, the US probably can have a flexible, and actually did 2009 to about 2011 a flexible fiscal policy because they're a large country, they don't depend much on the rest of the world, they produce most of the things they consume, so they can do it. Germany to some extent in certain sectors tried. Remember 2009, 10, 11 they had this basically fiscal stimulus that was if you buy a German car, basically we buy your old car for free, roughly speaking. But they produce cars, the same. We had again a discussion in Bulgaria, let's have this type of policy. And I said, so what are we going to be buying? We don't have cars, we don't have fridges. What exactly are we going to buy that's made in Bulgaria so that we can have a flexible fiscal policy? At that point, politicians become very creative. And the more uneducated they are, the more creative they become. Maybe we should actually create something that's Bulgarian and then buy it. So there are many politicians around the world that sort of when you tell them, well, there's nothing to buy or not that many things to buy, they say, don't worry, we'll produce a Bulgarian car or, we'll produce a Bulgarian television and then we'll buy that, and it becomes even worse. I think the countries in our region, because of the vestiges of communism, even after 25 years, have this kind of tendency to invent how government should help even further. And then it becomes a big disaster. So small countries, flexible fiscal policies never work. Large countries, they may work, but you have to be large enough and not too corrupt to be able to pull it through, and some countries have. So that's why I say there are situations where you could use it within reason, and it can smooth out the economic period. So Germany used it successfully during the period when all other countries are going down, or Germany is in a recession now, so you can postpone it, but you cannot completely get rid of the business cycle. Well, yeah, okay. Last question maybe.
So my question is about the dilemmas which we have now. One hand we have to integrate in European Union and implement the policy which is developed by these countries and by this area, which means also too much regulations, which we have. It's really much for the Georgia as well. And on the other hand, we have the kind of ranking as a doing business or many others, which is really good measuring instruments for the investors of the country. And so what do you think about this dilemma, and which should be done firstly? To think about this ranking, or just starting to implement or find some solution to implement some regulations, and also create some inspections or other institutions?
Yeah, no, I understand. It's a very good question. So first, this question is overplayed, and it seems that today, since I've been asked by a number of journalists this question, so it must be really overplayed in Georgia, or perhaps to... Okay, so it must be quite overplayed. So first, EU regulation covers is mostly in the social area. So EU regulation covers very little in terms of the business area. It doesn't cover taxes. Taxes are sovereign. It doesn't have starting a business. It doesn't cover contract enforcement. The judicial system is independent. It doesn't cover bankruptcy. It doesn't cover trading across borders, other than the fact that you have to have some rules vis-a-vis third parties, not vis-a-vis your own. So in your case, you may have to impose some visas on non-Europeans. Yesterday I was actually being checked, is Bulgaria in Europe or not? Yes, it is, go. But, you know, but outside of that, the only area that really affects business business regulation and is dictated by the European Union is environmental regulation, where indeed both businesses and the government over time have to implement a number of regulations that most of our countries didn't have. And they do impose some cost, but they also have arguably good social benefits. But in the other areas, there's actually, at least in the areas that we study, there is no impact, direct or indirect, of European rules. There have been many discussions in which I have also participated in common fiscal policy, common tax policy, common policy towards new firms, but it has really not gone anywhere. There is such a thing as a European firm, so in addition to your own establishment of firms in Bulgaria, you can also establish a European firm you want, but you have the choice. It's not mandatory to do so. So the comment that you see we need to implement a lot of European regulations and things are going to get worse is simply not true in the business area. There are many other areas in terms of healthcare, for example, environment I mentioned, healthcare, some of the social areas where there are such rules and regulations, but typically they're on the behavior of government, not on the behavior of firms. So I would say that on average in that regard, entry into the EU is either neutral or actually positive even. You cannot blame it on the EU for the fact that that things may get worse.
The ranking is good indicator. Denmark is there in top 10. Norway, which has economically the EU regulation, is there. Lithuania is there, so not in top 10, but in the league.
Close, yeah. Estonia is there as well, just after Georgia. So no, there are quite a number of European countries that UK is actually quite high. Ireland is quite high. It has fully the European regulation. UK has most of the EU regulation. I think Ireland is now in the top 10, so close to the top 10. So it's not.
Denmark is there, certainly.
Yeah. Okay. No, so it's very easy to blame the EU for this or that. Usually they do things that they can be blamed for, but this is not one of these. That's right. So in this case, you need to defend the EU. They do the right thing. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for coming. It was a very short notice, so I also appreciate the attention.